Before we get started today, I want to talk about one of our affiliate partners, Riverside FM. I had been unhappy with my old podcast host for a while and was looking for other options. I discovered Riverside FM and learned that for one low monthly fee, it would help me record the podcast and utilize video capabilities. It uses AI technology to easily create clips from each episode that I can share on my social media accounts. I don't consider myself very tech savvy, but audio and video editing with Riverside FM software has been a breeze, and I actually look forward to recording days now. If you are looking for a company that will help you with all your podcasting, webinar, and video needs, I encourage you to check out Riverside FM. You won't be disappointed. I'll include a link for you in the show notes. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 131, an interview with Terry Harmon, author of the true crime book, Convoluted. In last week's episode, I discussed the details of the 1972 murders of the Durham family from Boone, North Carolina. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Terry Harmon, author of the book Convoluted, which he began researching after local law enforcement shared their belief that members of the Georgia-Dixie Mafia had participated in the triple homicide. Terry Harmon is a native and lifelong resident of Watauga County and has a deep interest in genealogy and local history. He is a graduate of Appalachian State University in Boone and has worked at Samaritan's Purse, also in Boone, for more than 28 years. He was 6 years old when the Durham family, which lived 2 miles away from his own family, was murdered. From then on, Harmon was fascinated by the case, which eventually turned cold. 50 years after the murders, local authorities announced that the killers had been identified and the case was closed. But Harmon had lingering questions and embarked upon a 2-year investigation to find answers to those questions. His book, Convoluted, is a result of that quest. To learn more about Terry Harmon and his writing, you can visit his author website at terryharmon.com. So thank you for joining us today, Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. So let's get started with the questions. You were a young child living in the area when the Durham family murders occurred. What can you remember about the community's response to the crime?
Well, I was only 6 at the time of the murder, so I don't really have any specific memories from that time. I lived with my parents about 2 miles from the Durham residence, and we didn't know them personally. My uncle had been in school with Bobby Durham, both in high school, and at the time of the murders, he was taking a university class with him at Appalachian State University. But yeah, when you're 6 years old, you don't really maybe grasp what all's going on. I can vaguely remember my parents having a conversation about the murders with some friends who were visiting. But I was 6, my sister was 9, my brother was 10. And it could be also that our parents really didn't say that much about it because of our ages. My brother has mentioned to me that he recalled being very frightened. I think he had more of an awareness of what had happened than I did. And he can also remember the fact that our parents previously never locked our doors, but after the murders, they started locking the doors. And I think that was true for a lot of people in our community. And then as I began working on the book and researching it and talking to people about what they remembered, I really got more of a sense of the pervasiveness of the fear at that time and started reading accounts of how lots of people started locking their doors. And there was an increase in local sales of firearms, ammunition, alarms, things of that nature. So my parents had kept a couple of newspaper articles from the time, and it wasn't until I was a little bit older, as I was sorting through things in the drawers and came across those and really read more in depth about what happened. So it was a bit later before I began to really understand what had gone on and to appreciate how horrible it had been.
Yeah, I'm sure your parents were not wanting to talk in great depth about it around the kids, because it is a very scary thing to hear about. Even just looking at the crime scene photos, that's not something you would want to share with your children, because especially when it didn't get solved right away.
That's right.
There,
Yeah,
it's just terrifying.
it's like any small rural town where things like that never happen, and you never imagined that they could happen, and then suddenly it did happen. And because it wasn't solved and nobody knew who had killed them or why, there was thought in the community of, well, is there some, deranged person out there just breaking into homes and killing people at random? And could we be next? It really, the unknown played into the fear even more so.
Yes. So you were originally working on a book documenting a variety of crimes in Watauga County over the years. How and why did you make the decision to focus your efforts solely on a book about this triple homicide?
About 5 years ago, I had started working on this other book. I've always grown up loving history, loving local history, genealogy, anything to do with family stories and local things. So I belonged to this and still do. At the time, we used to meet as a group, but now it's shifted to a Facebook page group called Watauga History Hunters. And one of the questions we were discussing back at that time was where the old county jails used to be located. And I was really intrigued by that. But then I also got to wondering, well, I wonder who was incarcerated in all those old jails. And so I started researching historical crime. Our county was founded in 1849. So that was the year I planned to start covering. But because I had grown up with the Durham murders, and it was, really probably the biggest crime that people remember here. Anybody who was living here in 1972 knows about the Durham murders. And so I was trying to decide, well, what period of time do I want this book to cover? So I started with 1849 and decided to go through 1974, which would be a 125-year period. And I chose 1974 specifically because it would encompass the 1972 Durham murders. So, again, I didn't know a tremendous amount about the Durham case other than like what the newspapers had reported or a few magazines along the way or just what local people had been told. And then that surprising announcement came from the Watauga County Sheriff's Office in 2022. And it was really just incredible because, 50 years had passed. And at that point, I think I, like most people, had thought this is never going to be solved and we'll never know any more about it. So when they said that they had identified the killers of the Durhams, I immediately sort of put the other book on pause because I wanted to find out what these new developments were. And I had the opportunity to go to Sheriff Lynn Hageman's press conference that he held a few days after that announcement and was able to ask a few questions. But really, I had so many more questions, really beyond what even the press conference would allow. And it wasn't just about me and my questions. There were a lot of people from the news media there with their own questions. But when I left that meeting, I just felt like there's so much more I want to know. And I want to know, well, what did these men from Georgia say? And how did they know that these were the guys? And so I felt like the only way I would really know that was just to start investigating it on my own and to start digging. So I put the other book on pause and decided, really within the hour of that press conference, that I wanted to write a standalone book about the Durham case. And it seemed very daunting to even think that I could do that, and really didn't know where to begin. But that's how it came about. I was working on that book and then shifted my focus specifically to the Durham case.
I have to say, I'm so impressed by the amount of research that went into that book, as well as all the interviews you were able to conduct. What was the process like researching and writing it?
Yeah, so I actually started writing that very evening after the press conference. I believe that was on a Friday, and I didn't have to go to work the next day, which was good. because I actually wrote through the night. I didn't even go to bed. I wrote through the night into the next morning using all the resource materials I had at that time, which really wasn't a tremendous amount other than a few newspaper magazine articles and then the latest developments that had come out. There had been a variety of YouTube videos, and some other podcasters had covered this case through the decades. So I was able to access some online things like that. And then there were chat rooms and, online forums where sort of armchair detectives would talk about different cold cases and their thoughts on it. But really, when I finished writing by the next morning, I only had about 50 pages. And I thought, I don't even know if this is enough to warrant a book. So I knew I had to find out more. So I did begin digging heavily into newspaper archives and came up with a lot more articles that I had never seen before. And some of those did have new information other than what I already had in my possession. But I also scheduled some after meetings with Sheriff Lynn Hageman at the Watauga County Sheriff's Department. And he was very gracious, very open with me, and allowed me to have access to the old investigative file, which really contained a lot of information that the general public, including myself, had never even known had occurred. So that was a real treasure trove of information. And then, of course, I did want to start conducting my own interviews. And, with the passage of 50 years, a lot of the people who had investigated the crime were now deceased. Some of the main players in this story had passed away. And then, of course, with that much passage of time, some people's memories have faded and don't recall some of the specifics they might have at that time. But I did end up interviewing more than 100 people. Some of the people, that was one thing that was surprising to me, was that some of the people were very concerned about their anonymity and did not want me to reveal that I had spoken with them. So that's why in the start of the book, where I'm thanking people, I list quite a few people who I did speak with by name, and then I ended it with anonymous others. But some people were still very afraid to talk about this case, even after all these decades. There's still a bit of fear that there might be some people that were involved that still might, seek some kind of retribution. But yeah, that was the process, just really gathering that information. And in the end, I really had more than I could use because, as you can see, it's still a very thick book, 500 or so pages. Of course, that includes lots of pages of endnotes and footnotes. But yeah, then I had to start the process of trying to streamline it and cut some things out. And one of the biggest challenges was, with such a plethora of information, how do I organize this in such a way that it's going to make sense to the reader and also keep them engaged? On the one hand, I kind of wanted it to be like an encyclopedia of the case, like anything that you want to know about the case you can find in this book. But I didn't want it to read just like some kind of forensic account or a police report. It had to be in an engaging story form from chapter to chapter that would keep the reader intrigued and want to keep reading. So that was a bit of a challenge to achieve both of those goals, but hopefully I did it okay. As I go back and read suggestions of how to write a book like this, I read an article about investigative reporting that said when you're dealing with a complex subject matter like this, the best way to do it is chronologically, and so that's the way I approached it, just taking the readers decade by decade, how the case was investigated and what they found.
Yes, I thought it was organized in a really good way. Like you said, it is sort of like an encyclopedia. And I found myself, I will admit, I haven't read it straight through because I didn't have time to yet,
Yeah.
but I did look at a lot of it in pieces. And whenever I would have a question, it's organized in such a way that I was able to find what I was looking for pretty easily. So for anyone that's wanting to check out the book, and I really recommend this should be used in a criminal justice class. I'm just going to tell you,
Thank you.
because I've read a lot of true crime books, and some of them just aren't very good. They're not organized very well. The writing's not great, but it really tells the story in a linear fashion. But also, it's easy to look for certain pieces of information if that's what you're specifically looking for.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that feedback. That's good to know.
You're welcome. I just could not get over the amount of research and how much time it had to have taken to do all those interviews.
Yeah, at times I work a full-time job, but at times I felt like I was working 2 jobs. It was kind of an exhausting process, but it was also exhilarating because, I was learning along the way, and to learn about something that you had grown up with and thought you knew about, and then you're learning all this new information, it was very intriguing to me. So even though it was a tiring process, that's what kept me going because I never knew from day to day who I might talk to or what I might learn.
So I do have a question about that. How did you find the people to talk to? Was it like you talked to a couple of people and then they would call a couple of people and tell them to call you? And I have a feeling it
Yeah,
kind of unraveled that way.
yeah, in some instances. Well, being a native of Boone, I knew a lot of the people who were involved in this story from law enforcement and just people who lived in the neighborhood or who happened to serve on the jury or
Wow.
for the probable cause here or whatever,
Hmm.
So, and also because I had spent so many years working on genealogy, I have this huge database, a family tree database of almost every person and family historically in Watauga County. So that sometimes is very informative because when you find out, oh, well, here's this person, but how was he related to this person? Okay, well, then that makes sense that they would have that relationship with that connection. And so, I really just knew a lot of the people firsthand just from growing up here. So I started compiling a list of those folks to talk to. Now, some of the folks involved in the story, like Troy Hall, of course, I didn't know until I started working on the book that he had passed away at 19. The Durham's daughter, Jenny Durham Hall, now Mackey, is still living. Troy Hall's brothers, Ray and John, are still living. And they all had, they make an appearance in the story of this book. And so I did reach out to them with letters, with certified letters, but I actually didn't expect them to contact me or be willing to participate just because historically they have never spoken to the media about the case to any great extent. And so I did not get a response from them, and I was not able to talk to them directly. But as you were saying, sometimes I would just be talking to a person and they would say, oh, well, you really need to talk to so and so because they were a neighbor or they knew this person when they were growing up. And so it did kind of lead from one person to another. When I was researching more about Troy Hall's life in Georgia after he left North Carolina and learning about him becoming an attorney, and then I was able to find out, that one of the fellows he served with as an assistant district attorney is now a judge in Georgia. And I was able to reach out to him to say, well, what do you remember about Troy and working with him? And yeah, so it was people from all kinds of different walks of life, and able to talk to some people who knew the guys from Asheville who were arrested at one point. Yeah, so it was also interviewed Rufus Edmiston. At the time, Rufus Edmiston was an attorney general, not at the time of the murders, but not too many years after. And so, as Attorney General, he was over the State Bureau of Investigation. And Rufus is also a native of Boone, so, this is his home county as well. But I was able to speak with him, and he wrote the foreword to my book. So, yeah, it was just how it kind of came together little by little.
When learning about cold cases, people are always interested in what types of physical evidence are left behind at a murder scene. And this murder occurred in 1972 when evidence collection was handled a lot differently. What can you say to me about the physical evidence that was left behind? And was there anything that you learned that surprised you?
Yeah. Well, really, the case was a victim of its times, so to speak. Like you were saying, in 1972, things were not as sophisticated or developed. And, really, you have to consider, too, again, this was a small rural town. Um, our law enforcement was not super sophisticated in terms of law enforcement training. They had never been faced with a case like this, particularly a triple homicide. And so I think they were at a little bit of a loss how to even handle it or approach it. And sadly, the crime scene was very poorly contained, and all kinds of people went through the house that night. Like, my understanding is that even neighbors went in the house and saw the bodies and came back out sort of in little groups at a time. And so you just had a lot of people in the house who really didn't have any business being there. And unfortunately, in the process, I think there was a lot of contamination of the crime scene and maybe even evidence that was lost. And then, of course, there just wasn't the technology to do analysis of evidence like there is today. Speaking of genealogy, one of the things that really interests me at this point is forensic genealogy and how that's being used, how the DNA testing is being used through genealogy databases to solve cold cases. Unfortunately, there were no bodily fluids at the scene other than some blood being found on the carpet in the den, which is where they thought the family was attacked. And somehow it was determined that that was Virginia Durham's blood. Now, there were hundreds of fingerprints that authorities lifted from both the Durham home and the Durham vehicle. And over the decades, those have been run periodically through APHIS, which is the automated finger indexing system they have. But unfortunately, there were never any matches other than to the Durhams themselves, or, for example, the medical examiner who I think at one time put his hand on the wall when he bent down to view the bodies. They had to do a lot of elimination. People who were not suspects, like law enforcement or emergency personnel or maybe family members and friends. But there are still a lot of prints that have never been matched to anyone. And curiously, even when the Dixie Mafia guys were alleged to be the killers, they did obtain their fingerprints, but they didn't match any prints that had been lifted from the crime scene. Now, of course, the killers very well could have worn gloves and never left any fingerprints. So beyond that, probably the biggest piece of evidence was the rope that was found around Bryce Durham's neck, sort of in a slip knot or noose. And that is still retained by the sheriff's office. I've actually seen it in the evidence bag. Unfortunately, that has never been DNA tested. Of course, in 1972, DNA testing didn't exist. And then later, as that technology became available, they were initially told that if it had been submerged in water, it could not be DNA tested. And it had been submerged. Since that time, technology's even advanced further that even submerged items can be tested for DNA. And the sheriff's office has told me that they had gotten mixed responses from the state crime laboratory in Raleigh as to whether it could be tested. And then there was some indication that it might have to be sent to an independent lab, which could be very costly and probably outside of the sheriff's office's budget. And so at one point I had said, well, what if I pay for it, or what if I raise the funds to have it tested? And I was told, well, we would want to make sure that it could be tested, but I kind of feel like it's, well, you'll never know until you do it, and it may reveal nothing. But again, you'll just never know until it's done. So another hindrance might be the fact that since the sheriff's office has declared the case closed, there is some hesitancy on the part of the state crime laboratory to say, why do you want us to test this when the case has been closed? Why do we want to spend our time and effort on this for something that's already closed? So I don't feel like it's really going anywhere at this point, but that's really, I would say the rope is really the only piece of evidence at this point that anything could be done with. I had asked at one point about the clothing that the Durhams were wearing, because if their killers were not wearing gloves and touched their clothing or touched, their bodies, they could have left touch DNA, which can be tested for now, but nobody seems to know what was done with the Durham's clothing. Don't even know that it was saved. So anyway, it looks like the rope might be the only thing, but whether it will ever be tested or not, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And if somebody was using gloves while they were using it, then nothing would be left behind. So I will say that when you read about the lack of physical evidence left behind, you do think this had to be professional. with the bathtub being included, the water, not a lot of evidence left behind. This just does not seem like a random break in where people were attacked and killed.
Right.
That is with the lowest level of knowledge of the crime, that is what I thought when I read about it. But I do want to talk about the four young men that were initially arrested from Asheville that were part of the breaking and entering ring. So why can you talk to me a little bit about why the charges were eventually dropped? And also, I have another question about that. Do you think Troy Hall knew them?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the four men from Asheville, yeah, so that kind of came up. I think law enforcement, they just weren't having any success in developing many leads. And so it was kind of like they didn't really know where to turn. And of course, the murders were so high profile that they were on the radar of surrounding counties' law enforcement. And so in Madison County, North Carolina, Sheriff E.Y. Ponder, he was the sheriff at that time, and he was dealing with that sort of pervasive theft ring, young men who were robbing houses and stealing things like guns and jewelry and anything, of value. And he was having a hard time sort of reining that in. But because the Durham home had been ransacked and they believed some items had been taken, I think Ponder had in his mind that, well, maybe there's some connection between what's going on in my region and what happened in Watauga County. And so when he was able to arrest some of those guys, he initially questioned them, but wasn't finding necessarily any connection to the Durham murders. But there was one guy in particular, Dean Chandler was one of those four. And Dean he already had a criminal history, and he had been released on probation 10 years earlier than what his sentence was, with the condition that he did not get convicted of further criminal activity, or he would have to come back and serve those 10 years that he was sort of given free on. So the thought is that Dean, in his mind, said, well, if I can give them some information about the Durham case and I'll get a deal for myself where they'll either drop other charges that are against me or not prosecute them, then I'll avoid having to go back to prison for, to serve those extra 10 years plus whatever they sentence me to. And I think he also had in mind that he could potentially get the reward money for the Durham case. And so he called Sheriff Ponder and said, I'm willing to talk about the Durham case now. And so he gave this very detailed and elaborate sworn statement. And if you read his account of what he said, it's kind of like, wow, how did he know all these details? Like, it sounds very plausible that this is what happened. And then there were people who said that they had seen Troy Hall in the company of these men. Some people said they saw him in a diner in Asheville where he was in their company. Troy Hall's next door neighbor in Boone, when these guys were arrested and their pictures were in the newspaper, said, oh, I recognize some of these guys as having come to Troy's trailer. So there was reason to believe that Troy knew them. Now, some might say, well, we know that Troy was involved in other things. Even the murders aside, he was involved in some drug deals and pornography and things like that. And so some might say, well, maybe he just knew these guys because they were involved in stolen goods or drug trafficking, and maybe it didn't have anything to do with the murders. And that's a possibility, although it just makes you wonder if there wasn't more to that. But eventually, they didn't have enough evidence to really convict these guys on. And so at the probable cause hearing, they already released Eugene Guerin and Dewey Coffey, but they did charge Jerry Cassidy and Dean Chandler with the murders and accessory to murder. But then as their trials came up, they just didn't have enough evidence. And their defense attorneys were arguing that Ponder had actually asked Chandler to make this statement because Ponder was so fed up with these guys robbing homes in his area that he saw maybe the Durham case as a way, like if he could get them convicted for the Durham case, then that would solve his robbery problem too, because they would go to prison for murder. So it came out that Ponder actually did bring Dean Chandler to Boone and show him the Durham home and the Durham house. And so their defense attorney's argument was, well, he did that so that he could offer details that would corroborate the story that he was telling. And then years later, Watauga County authorities went back to Asheville and interviewed both Jerry Cassidy and Dean Chandler. And one of the officers said, well, if you'll just tell us what really happened, we can make sure that you have immunity and that you do get the reward money. And Chandler was like, well, yeah, I'd love to have the money and I could continue to lie if that's what you want me to do. But he said, you'll never solve this case if you continue to believe the story that I told at that time. So that's why they were suspected and how it came about that they were charged. But in the end, they just didn't have anything to make it stick.
Right. But they very possibly could have known Troy. That's
Yeah, and it's
interesting.
and it's odd if as you read my book, it's like these Asheville guys keep popping up at different intervals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, why do they keep showing up on the scene? So it makes you wonder if there still couldn't be some validity to their involvement. Even if they weren't the killers, it's kind of like, the question is who instigated the murders and how did they get the killers to come into the home and murder the Durhams? And so is it like, well, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy. And so
Right.
could it have been somebody in Boone who said to somebody in Wilkes County, who said somebody in Buncombe County, who knew somebody in Georgia? I don't know how it all played out, but the Asheville guys still could have played some role in it, even if they weren't the killers.
Right. That's what I was thinking when I was reading about them, was that they were so young, and while they had definitely been breaking and entering, I just don't know that I've had a sense that they were sophisticated enough to pull off the murders
Yeah,
specifically. But like you said, somebody could have talked to somebody else who knew somebody else who knew a guy. So you just never know. But that they did, I felt like, kept their names just kept popping up for some reason.
right.
You know,
Yeah,
we may not ever know why, but I like that you spent that much time discussing it in the book, because that was one of the big headlines just a couple of months after the murders, was 4 men apprehended in the Durham murders,
right.
and then nothing.
Yeah,
you know
yeah. And if you look at those guys' criminal histories, even though they had committed a real string of crimes, they were never known to have murdered anybody. So it did seem kind of odd that in this instance, they said, well, they finally decided, well, the Durhams surprised these guys while they were in the house robbing the house. And so these guys had to kill the Durhams. To me, that doesn't hold water because one of the things they found on the crime scene was where the whoever had prepared snacks for themselves, and there was partially consumed soft drinks and snacks in the den where they were potentially watching television. And it's like, well, how did those snacks get prepared? If the killers were already in the house when the Durhams came, nobody's going to prepare snacks after that fact. So that didn't make sense to me.
that brings to mind something else I wanted to ask you about. One of the toughest photos I noticed in the book was the crime scene photo with their dog.
Yes.
Their dog, who survived, was the only survivor in the house, staying with the bodies. I So knowing that there was a small dog in the house, again, you don't think, if there was a small dog in the house and the Durhams came home and somebody was already in the house, that dog would have alerted them that somebody was in the house, or that dog would not have survived, if you
Yeah.
ask me. So I think that's also another thing you have to think about, that what I'm guessing is that poor dog went and hid during the murders and then came back out after the killers were gone.
Right.
So that was something that, just as a dog owner, when I saw that photo, it broke my heart.
Yeah, it was very touching. I did not even know until I started working on this book that they had a dog or that there were crime scene photos where the dog was present. And even the local newspaper, the Watauga Democrat, probably the week after the murders, had a little blurb in the paper about the dog, whose name was Tiny, as I understand. But yeah, yeah, very sad.
Yeah, it is. So, in the book, you discuss some of the factors that may have contributed to this case going cold for so long. I thought you did a really great job doing that. Can you share some of your thoughts on that with us? I mean, obviously, we know that crime scene evidence was part of the problem, but what were some of the other factors?
I would say just a lack of information. And There would be long stretches of years over the decades where they would have no leads whatsoever. No one was coming forth with any new information. And so I think they really just didn't know where to turn. And it was just kind of like a waiting game, waiting for somebody to come forward and speak up or say something that they remembered. And there were various times that law enforcement would sort of make a public announcement, just pleading with the public, if anybody knows anything, could you come forward? At one time, between the administrations of Sheriff Ward Carroll and Sheriff Red Lyons, the investigative file that they had in the sheriff's office disappeared. And so when Sheriff Red Lyons came into office, he kind of had to start from scratch. Like he didn't even have the resources, the resource material that had been accumulated up to that point. And he really felt like the reward money needed to be increased, that maybe that would be the impetus for causing someone to speak who maybe hadn't previously spoken. It's sad that it takes money to make people talk, but sometimes that's the circumstance. And then Sergeant Jeff Rucker with the Boone Police Department was also instrumental in introducing Crime Stoppers in Watauga County. And they had been successfully using that for other crimes, and they thought, well, maybe we can leverage this for the cold Durham case. And so they started putting out some more public service announcements, and did come up with some more leads, but unfortunately nothing that would lead to the solution of the crime. So again, I think it was, it started the night of the murders. Nobody intended for it to become a cold case, but because of the crime scene being poorly handled, that was one strike against it. And then just the fact that nobody ever came forward with any information, even when they tried to prosecute the Asheville guys, and that went nowhere. And then you're back to square one, and it's like, where do we go from here? So, yeah, I think it was just the biggest part was lack of evidence and witnesses.
Speaking of witnesses, this question just came to me. Were you the one that uncovered the eyewitnesses the night of the crime that the repairman and a couple of other people saw, or was that in the investigative
That
files?
was in the investigative file. At one point, the sheriff's office just really was at a standstill. The case wasn't going very far, and they were continuously dealing with budgetary shortages and manpower shortages. They just didn't have enough officers also to devote full time to the case. And so at one point, even though the sheriff's office retained jurisdiction over the case, because the case was actually just outside the Boone town limits, even though their address was Boone. And so the sheriff's office had jurisdiction, but at one point they turned over the investigation to the Boone Police Department. Captain Arlie Isaacs was very instrumental in conducting a lot of those interviews, particularly in the mid to late 70s. So the repairman who saw the cars and people who were traveling along the 105 bypass that night said they saw some suspicious looking men and cars coming down the road. Those were all within the investigative file and were interviews that Captain Isaacs had conducted.
Yeah, I thought those were really interesting because, on the one hand, it was a snowy night, and you could see maybe a four-wheel drive car following someone else trying to make sure they got home okay. But the fact that they were seen coming out of that driveway specifically, there weren't a lot of up that road that they lived on. That was what,
No.
an apartment, a little small set of apartments, maybe one or two houses.
Well, there were actually several houses, but yeah, there was an apartment complex, and then there were several houses, but the Durham's house was pretty much at the apex of that road. There were a few houses behind the Durham's, and the road eventually came to a dead end. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't super populated. And people would just describe the Jimmy, assuming they're talking about the Jimmy, they would say, well, it was a Blazer or it was a Jeep. And if you go back and look at the body styles of all those vehicles back in 1972, they look very similar. So I could see how people might mistake it for one thing or another, or how some people call any soft drink a Coke. Maybe
Right.
maybe any vehicle like that they refer to as a Jeep. But yeah, those eyewitness accounts were new to me as well, and so when I read those in the investigative file, it was very intriguing.
It was because the fact that there were at least three men wearing toboggans and overcoats, I mean, that just, I don't know.
I mean, there again, it was the mountains of North Carolina. So
Right.
lots of people wore heavy coats and toboggans probably that night. But yeah, to be in the vicinity of the house,
Hmm.
yeah, in hindsight, it looks sort of suspicious.
Yeah, it does. You have to wonder if there was a connection. But of course, when you're driving past a road and you notice that, you don't think that somebody just got murdered up the street and that you need
No,
to be really paying attention to these people on the side of the road. I mean,
that's right.
nobody, especially on a snowy night, you just wouldn't think that.
Yeah.
So was there any information that came up in your research that was a surprise to you? And if
Yeah.
so, what was it?
Well, I'll start by saying the Dixie Mafia. I was not familiar with that term. As I researched them and learned more about them, it was interesting that the Dixie Mafia was involved in the death of Sheriff Buford Pusser, which we all know from the movie Walking Tall. I really didn't know the history of that, and so I wanted to know more about the Dixie Mafia first of all, like who were they? And it was really just sort of a ragtag group. It wasn't organized like the Northern Mafia, like, the Italian families and the Godfathers that we think of. In the South, it was just kind of like a bunch of ragtag Southern criminals who did anything from moonshining to robbing houses to arson and murder. And they didn't even necessarily know each other. I mean, it went from Texas to Louisiana to Florida and South Carolina, and not even so much in North Carolina. But the way it was made to sound was like, well, this is the Dixie Mafia. Like these four guys from Georgia are the Dixie Mafia. But
Right.
that was just they were just from the small town of Winder, Georgia, and they didn't even know the people in Texas who were considered to be Dixie Mafia. And in fact, Billy Sunday Burt, one of the alleged killers, at one point he said, I'd never even heard of the Dixie Mafia myself until I saw in the newspaper that I was their hitman. And they said that Billy Wayne Davis didn't really like that term. So I don't know how much they even thought of themselves being part of the Dixie Mafia. But I did investigate because I thought, well, was there a presence of the Dixie Mafia in North Carolina? And I actually found that there were attributions to the group of crimes around the same time frame of the Durham murders. And in fact, I think it was within the year after the Durham murders, there were what were called the mummy murders in Raleigh, where three people were wrapped in duct tape, even around their heads and mouths and noses, and suffocated, and they were also tied up. And it had some similarities to the Durham case, and so you there were different men that were accused of that, but again, they were supposedly from the Dixie Mafia. So it made you wonder, was the Dixie Mafia really active in North Carolina? But one of the other surprising things, so in the investigative file was a list of probably 400 people whose fingerprints had been compared to those lifted from the Durham crime scene. And so I actually ended up Googling all 400 plus of those names to see who were these people. Some of them I knew, like they were local people, like law enforcement, which were just elimination prints. But as I looked at the people who had criminal records, a good chunk of them were alleged to be associated with the Dixie Mafia at some point. When this announcement was made in 2022 that the Dixie Mafia had killed the Durhams, even local law enforcement were saying, this was never on our radar. Georgia was not on their radar. We had never heard of the Dixie Mafia. And I don't know if the current administration had never really gone back and looked at the old file and said, well, who are these people who were accused? And they didn't have any knowledge that they had alleged Dixie Mafia connections. So I just found that really interesting that it wasn't the first time Dixie Mafia had been mentioned in relation to this case, but I think with the passage of time, those who maybe knew about it at the time, it either wasn't pursued or it was forgotten, so that the current law enforcement officers really didn't even know that that was a thing. A couple of other interesting things to me, Troy Hall and his life in Georgia is very intriguing. He eventually became an attorney, graduated from John Marshall Law School in Atlanta, and then established a law practice in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Lawrenceville is only about a 30-minute drive from Winder, Georgia, where these Dixie Mafia guys who are alleged to be the killers were based. And so I found that curious. It maybe doesn't mean anything, but I thought how strange that he lived in such close proximity to these guys who are claimed to have killed his in laws. Another thing about Troy, one of the challenges for me and one of the things that I had hoped to discover was, could I prove a connection between Troy Hall and these Georgia guys? And in the end, I mean, I found some suspicious things, but nothing that I could ever prove. A very interesting thing to me was when I was talking to Sheriff Lynn Hageman one day, he just sort of casually mentioned that Troy was alleged to have married one of the daughters of Larry Flint, who was the publisher of Hustler magazine. And knowing that Troy was involved in pornography, I thought, well, that kind of makes sense. But I just kind of filed that away in the back of my head. I didn't think too much about it. And then as I had time, I came back to that and I thought, well, who were the daughters of Larry Flint? So I started looking into that. And as I researched that, I thought, I don't think any of these women were ever married to Troy Hall. But what I did find was that Larry Flint, so he had been brought up on obscenity charges in Gwinnett County, Georgia. His defense attorney was Gene Reeves. And at one point during the trial, Gene Reeves and Larry Flint were both shot, and that's why Larry Flint ended up in a wheelchair, for the rest of his days. But they both survived, and then I thought, well, who is Gene Reeves? What's about him? And so he had also graduated from John Marshall Law School. Now, granted, many years before Troy Hall did, and before Troy even went to Georgia. But Gene Reeves became an attorney and later a judge, and also worked with law enforcement in Gwinnett County. But I did find that at one point he was Billy Sunday Burt's defense attorney. So you mentioned in your last episode of your podcast about the murders of Reed and Lois Fleming in Rennes, Georgia, and that came to be a case that was compared to the Durhams and used in part to say, well, we believe the same guys committed both murders. But anyway, Gene Reeves defended Billy Sunday Burt in that case, and then he eventually married a lady whose brother was married to Billy Sunday Burt's wife. So there was this familial connection. Again, that's where I sort of used genealogy, but there was an intermarriage there between Reeves and Billy Sunday Burt's wife's family. Well, then what was really surprising was that Troy Hall's second wife was the stepdaughter of Gene Reeves. So I thought, so there's this odd connection. Now, at the time that he married her, Gene Reeves and her mother had already divorced, so he was technically no longer her stepfather. But I thought, how strange. It wasn't that Troy married a daughter of Larry Flint. He married the stepdaughter of Larry Flint's defense attorney, who had a connection to Billy Sunday Burt, who was alleged to kill Troy's first in-laws. So again, it doesn't prove that Troy knew the Dixie Mafia or that he enlisted them, but it's just another one of those strange things that you think, is this just coincidental or could this really mean something? So I'm still at a loss as to what the answer is, but I found that really surprising.
It is, because when you think about it, at the time that the Durham murders occurred, Troy was only a 20-year-old college student, and
Right.
it didn't seem like he was very well traveled. I don't know that there was any evidence that he was going back and forth to Georgia, but for him to end up eventually, by the time, within 10 years, being in Georgia and surrounded by all these people with sort of the 6 degrees of separation,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
it is.
Like, what led him to Georgia? He could have gone anywhere.
Right. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And his brothers actually followed him there.
Right.
Although his brother John did retain a residence in North Carolina, but yeah, his brother Ray still lives in Duluth to this day. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
So, in the conclusion of your book, I loved that you wrote out your theory of who you think orchestrated the murders and why. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, I will. One of the things that I had really striven for was to be as objective and unbiased as possible in this case. I never embarked to prove that the Dixie Mafia didn't kill the Durhams or that they did. I was just hoping in the process that I might uncover more of the truth that would lead us to a resolution and maybe discover some things that law enforcement didn't. And I do think I uncovered a few things that even law enforcement hadn't realized. So in the end, it didn't help solve anything, but it at least gave some more food for thought. But I hesitated about sharing my theory because I thought, well, I've really tried to stay out of the fray and just be sort of the reporter and not take a side. But it's hard to write about a case like this and not have an opinion. And of course, as I would tell people that I was working on this, they'd say, well, what do you think? And so I was invariably asked for my opinion. And so I thought, well, at the risk of sacrificing my objectivity, I'll go ahead and share what I believe. But I did put the disclaimer in there that, if something comes to light in the years ahead that proves what I presently believe is wrong, then I reserve the right to change my mind. But I do believe that Troy Hall was the instigator of his in-laws' murders. That doesn't really vary that much from what most people have believed. Even law enforcement, I think from day one, suspected Troy. I mean, his behavior was so suspicious. He refused to initially give his fingerprints. They eventually did get those through his attorney, but his attorney advised him not to take a polygraph test, and so he never did. And he was asked on multiple occasions, but he always refused to do that. And then, according to the investigative file, the morning after the murders, I mean, just within hours after they were killed, he went to the dealership and rifled through all of the files, broke into Virginia Durham's desk looking for something, kicked a pair of her high heeled shoes across the showroom. And it's like, who, even if you don't have a good relationship with your in laws, who does that? Who exhibits
Right.
that kind of behavior within hours of their murders? And so, he just had, there were just lots of things that were suspicious about Troy. And Troy grew up in kind of a rough family, and they were not wealthy by any means. And so, he was living in a trailer park as a college student, didn't really have any money. But I think he always aspired to be wealthy and to be respected. And if you go back and look at Troy's history, even with some of his friendships in Wilkes County, he befriended a lot of young men who were from wealthier upper class families. And I think it was kind of another indicator of him wanting to be in their class, so to speak. And so he was always looking, I think, for ways to improve his circumstances. And he was a highly intelligent person. Unfortunately, I think he chose to move up in the world by unscrupulous means. And I just have a feeling that when he met Jenny Durham and realized that her family owned a car dealership, even though they weren't super wealthy by any means. They were higher class, so to speak, more socioeconomically than Troy was. And I think he perhaps saw that as an opportunity that maybe one day he could run the dealership. And if that was what he thought, I don't think he was even thinking of that in terms of being an upright businessman, but maybe somehow using that dealership as a front for his other illegal activities with stolen goods and drugs, drug trafficking. So, the Durhams, Jenny's parents did not like Troy, and they encouraged her constantly to leave him. And they didn't want him to be part of their business as they learned more about him and his corrupt dealings. They didn't want him hanging around the dealership. They changed the locks on both the dealership and their home in an attempt to keep him out. And they had started really digging into his past and learning more about who he was and who he had been involved in. And they even suspected that he was involved in a ring of operating in stolen goods out of Asheville, which might have actually even led them to those four Asheville guys. And then the big thing too, I think, was there was rumors that the Durhams were changing their wills and they were going to only leave Jenny $1 and the remainder of their estate to Bobby. And in the end, from a legal perspective, even if they had changed the wills and those wills had been found, as it turns out, Jenny would have ended up with everything anyway because Bobby would have died without a will and then by virtue of his death, she would have inherited his portion anyway. But Troy may not have understood that, and he thought if these wills are enacted, if they're actually put in place, then that means she's going to get nothing. And so I think he just saw all of this as working against him, and he didn't like the Durham's dislike of him and their interference with his relationship and sort of with his dreams, so to speak. And I think he, in his mind, thought, well, I kind of feel like he sort of shared his plight with other people and said, this is what I'm up against. And I don't know who else was involved, but I think he had help saying, well, this could be a solution to your problem. We can take the Durhams out and you still will achieve what you had hoped to. And so, there were reports of Troy being on Poplar Grove Road several times the week before the murders, which is where the Durham's Jimmy was abandoned, which may indicate that he was looking for a place for the Jimmy to be left and to be the point where the killers would come with their getaway car and leave from that point. So, yeah, I just believe based on his background, his personality, his actions, both before and after the murders, I think it really points to him being involved in the instigation of the murders. I don't believe he actually was there in the house or that he killed his in laws himself, but I definitely believe he was part of the planning.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the fact that he so carefully set up where he was going to be that night and then what time he came home, and then you had the whole instance with the phone call coming in, like you, I don't believe that was his mother in law calling. I think that that was probably a killer from inside the house calling to let him know
Yeah,
it's time
well,
to come up and check on your in laws.
right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he was a highly intelligent person who rarely ever had to study. So to believe that he needed to go on such a cold, snowy night to the university library and have a 5 hour study session doesn't make sense to me. But like you, I think that was him going to establish an alibi to be seen by people who could say that he was in the library. And then when he got home and then when they went back out to go to the Durham home, his car wouldn't start. And I'm not saying it's not possible for your battery to die immediately after you get home, because that has actually happened to me. But I tend to believe that Troy tampered with the car so that it would not start, which meant he would have to go enlist his neighbor Cecil Small, and I think he wanted Cecil to be the one to discover the bodies. Exactly sure why that was, but Cecil was a private investigator, and maybe Troy felt like, in the eyes of law enforcement, that would give a little more credence to the discovery and be less suspicious that Troy was there. But, when they got to the house, Cecil had a gun, and yet Troy went in first. If you're going into a home where your in laws are being attacked and you don't even know who still might be in the house, why would you not let the man with the gun go first? I certainly would. And then when they got inside the house, Troy went in one direction and Cecil went the other. Like, why wouldn't you stick with the man with the gun? So I think Troy just had in his mind that this was the way it was going to play out. Yeah, and then the phone call, I don't believe that happened. I believe Troy just manufactured that conversation. I believe it was someone calling to tell him it had been completed, and then he lied to Jenny about it being her mother. He knew they were dead when he got the phone call, and yet still he continued with this sort of ruse of going there to find out what's happening.
Yeah, it also, for someone who was not getting along with his relatives, with his in-laws, it just doesn't seem genuine that he would be so concerned to drive and go check on them late at
Yeah,
night.
yeah,
That's the other thing. Why was he so concerned that he needed to go check on them?
right.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is, do you believe Bobby was supposed to be in the house that night? Do you think he was meant to be one of the victims or not?
I do believe he was meant to be one of the victims. And I say that in part based on the theory of the will, that if Bobby was going to be the primary beneficiary of his parents' estates, then in order for Troy to gain access, then he had to have Jenny be the sole beneficiary. So I think in Troy's mind, it was like, well, Bobby has to be eliminated in order for the money to come to Jenny, which Troy then eventually, as I understand it, took from Jenny little by little, and even almost to the point that she had no money left, or hardly any money left, to complete her education at Appalachian State. But yeah, I think that was part of the plan, was that all three would be eliminated. And it kind of makes you wonder, when that witness saw a car with the Jimmy in the church parking lot just shortly before the Durhams arrived home, that might have been part of the plan, was to maybe somehow flag them or get them to pull over in order to make sure that Bobby was in the vehicle and that he was going home as well. Because Bobby sometimes did do things with friends, in the evenings, and there had been talk of him going to a basketball game with a friend. Maybe they were just making sure that Bobby was with them before they proceeded from that point.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this, and I recommend your book, Convoluted, the 1972 Durham family triple homicide, to anyone that wants to check that out. There's even more things in there that we did not talk about, so if you still have questions, it's in there. I guarantee you, if anybody has any more questions, it's in your book.
Thank you, Renee. I appreciate
Great
that.
job. Yeah, I appreciate it.
One thing I would just like to end with,
Yeah.
This story was always part of my life, and it always interested me, and that's partly why I wanted to tell it. But really, what I hope for, even though there's been a great passage of time, I still believe that there are people living who have information and know what happened. And I just feel like it's so sad that all these decades have passed, and it was too late to convict anybody. Even if these Dixie Mafia guys did it, three of them were already dead at the time that this came out, and the other one died shortly after. So no one was ever brought to justice.
And then Troy Hall died, the
Yeah.
other suspect.
So,
Which I thought that was interesting that you had a theory that he may not have died.
well, some people have had those thoughts that maybe he's still living and there was a faked death involved, because the year that this came out about the Georgia guys was 2019, and Troy died 6 months later. I don't know if that, if he did fake his death, that seemed to be a convenient window of time. But, I have a copy of his death certificate. Not that that couldn't be faked as well. I don't know. He probably is dead.
He didn't sound like he was in great health there.
No.
I think maybe his lifestyle caught up to him, is what
Yeah.
it seemed like.
But I still think there are people who could shed light on the case, and that was still a big hope of the book, that I could write this and still have it in the public consciousness, and there might still be people willing to come forward and share what they know. And so that's still my hope with it.
Well, let's hope so, because like you said, there probably is somebody out there that knows something.
Yeah.
Who would they contact if they did? The authorities?
Yeah,
in
I think the
Boone?
Watauga County Sheriff's Office. And to their credit, I have to say, even though they've officially said that the case is resolved, if something came up tomorrow that was a new piece of information, I'm convinced that they would be willing to take a look at that and see if that leads to a different direction. One thing I have to say about law enforcement, they're faced with a lot of current day crime. And so naturally that takes precedence over a 50-plus-year-old cold case. And I understand that. I'm very passionate about this case. So at times I would feel like, well, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you following this? But I have to, keep myself in check and say, well, they are protecting us in the here and now, and they do only have so much time and so many resources. So I don't want to be critical of them in that regard, but I do still hope maybe more will come from this case.
Yeah, me too. Well, again, thanks for being here today. And I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and sacrificing some of your time on a weekend to talk to me.
No problem. Thank you. I'm passionate about the case, so anytime I have an opportunity to share with people, I'm happy to.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd also like to support the show in a small way, You can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com, Renee Robertson. Thank you so much for those who have already supported me through this platform. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. Sound editing is provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.